The call came on a Tuesday at 2:47 p.m., right in the middle of my quarterly budget review. My phone lit up with his name, Marcus, and for a split second, I considered letting it go to voicemail. But 15 years of marriage had trained me to answer, even when I knew nothing good waited on the other end. His voice practically vibrated with triumph, each word dripping with the kind of smug satisfaction that makes your skin crawl. "Evelyn, I wanted to be the one to tell you this personally. I'm getting married tomorrow. To Sienna. We've been together for 9 months now, and honestly, she's everything you never were, supportive, fun, actually attractive." He paused, and I could hear him smiling through the phone. "Oh, and I've withdrawn all the money from our joint accounts. All $87,000. Thanks for being such a diligent saver, by the way. Also, I sold the house. Closed escrow yesterday for $650,000. You'll need to be out by Friday, or the new owners will have the sheriff remove you. I've already moved my things out, so don't bother looking for me. Consider this your official divorce notice. Goodbye, Evelyn." The line went dead. My colleagues stopped talking, their faces frozen in concern as they watched me sit there, phone still pressed to my ear. And then I laughed. Not the bitter, broken laugh of a devastated wife, but genuine, full-bodied laughter that echoed off the conference room walls and made everyone visually uncomfortable. If you've ever had someone underestimate you so completely they destroyed themselves, hit subscribe right now, because what Marcus didn't know was about to send him to prison, and only subscribers see how betrayal like this gets the justice it deserves. Don't miss what happens next. My boss suggested I take the rest of the day off, maybe see a therapist, because clearly I was in shock and not processing reality. But I wasn't in shock. I was processing perfectly. Because 3 weeks earlier, I'd received a very different phone call, one that Marcus knew nothing about. That call had come from the Federal Office of Trust Management, a government agency most people don't even know exists. The automated message had been clear and bureaucratic. Alert regarding property 447B Oakmont Drive. Attempted transaction detected on registered trust asset. Sale documentation submitted bearing unauthorized signatures. Federal verification process initiated. Contact this office within 72 hours to confirm authorization status. I'd called back within 90 minutes. What Marcus had never understood, what he'd never bothered to understand because he dismissed anything legal as boring paperwork, was that our house wasn't just our house. It was held in a government-registered irrevocable trust, established 3 years ago per the explicit instructions in my father's will. My father, Judge Theodore Blackwell, had spent 32 years on the federal bench watching people destroy each other over assets. He'd seen every kind of financial abuse, every variation of marital fraud, every way a vindictive spouse could weaponize property. So when he died and left me the inheritance that purchased that $650,000 colonial, he'd attached one non-negotiable condition: the house must be placed in a federal trust with me as sole beneficiary, protected by laws that make it literally impossible to sell, transfer, or mortgage without multiple government agency approvals and extensive federal verification. I'd shown Marcus the trust documents when we filed them. He'd glanced at the first page, seen words like irrevocable and beneficiary designation and federal registry, and his eyes had glazed over. "Whatever you need to do, babe," he'd said, already turning back to his laptop where he was researching his next guaranteed-to-fail business venture. What he'd failed to grasp, what would turn out to be the most expensive ignorance of his life, was that properties in these trusts are flagged in a federal database shared between the IRS, the state attorney's office, and financial fraud investigation units. Any attempt to sell them triggers an automatic alert to multiple law enforcement agencies. The system doesn't ask questions first. It assumes fraud, freezes everything, and launches an investigation immediately. So when Marcus submitted closing documents claiming sole ownership of a federally protected trust property, complete with what appeared to be my notarized signature authorizing the sale, he didn't just commit regular fraud. He committed federal fraud. Against a government-monitored asset. Using forged documents. while the transaction was automatically reported to law enforcement in real time. 2 weeks before his triumphant phone call, I'd sat in a deliberately unmarked office downtown, across from Detective Raymond Hayes of the Financial Crimes Unit. He was younger than I expected for someone handling federal cases, maybe early 40s, with the kind of tired eyes that suggested he'd seen enough human stupidity to fill several lifetimes. He'd laid out the evidence like a prosecutor preparing for trial, copies of the forged documents bearing my signature. A signature I'd never made, authenticated sale papers claiming I'd appeared before a notary I'd never met, title transfer forms declaring I willingly relinquished all property rights. "Mrs. Blackwell," he'd said, using my maiden name professionally, "your husband has committed multiple felonies. Identity theft, forgery, fraud in a real estate transaction, and because this involves a federally registered trust, we're looking at wire fraud and potentially racketeering charges. We've been building the case since the automatic alert came through. What we need from you is confirmation that you did not, at any time, authorize the sale or sign any of these documents." I'd confirmed everything. Provided my actual signature samples for comparison. Offered my alibi for the date I'd supposedly appeared before the notary. I'd been in a corporate tax seminar 300 miles away with 40 witnesses and hotel records. Detective Hayes had nodded, making notes, and then he'd asked me to do something that felt almost cruel: act like you know nothing. Don't confront him. Don't change your behavior. Let him think he's won. Men like Marcus, they get arrogant when they think they've gotten away with something. They celebrate. They make mistakes. They commit more crimes while we're watching. The more rope we give him, the more thoroughly he hangs himself. Can you do that? I could. I had. For 3 weeks, I'd watched Marcus move his belongings out in garbage bags while I was at work, had noticed the expensive new cologne he wore for his business meetings, had seen the charge for a luxury hotel venue on a credit card statement he'd forgotten I could access. I'd said nothing. Done nothing. Just documented everything and forwarded it to Detective Hayes, watching the case file grow thicker while Marcus grew more confident that he'd pulled off the perfect escape. But the worst part, the part that had actually made me cry in Detective Hayes's office, came when he showed me the complete financial forensics his team had compiled. Most people think they know their spouse's secrets, but what I discovered in those bank records made me realize I'd been married to a stranger. If you're still watching and not subscribed, you need to be, because what comes next proves that the people closest to us can be the most dangerous. Subscribe before you miss the twist that changes everything. Marcus hadn't just stolen from me. He'd stolen from my father's memory, desecrated his final act of faith in a way that felt like grave robbery. The forensics showed that 3 years ago, when my father died, he'd left Marcus a separate, confidential inheritance. $50,000, with a private letter the estate attorney had delivered directly to Marcus, man to man. My father had never told me the amount. He'd specified in his will that Marcus's inheritance remain confidential, a private gift between men, an investment in his potential, a final gesture of faith that he can become the man my daughter deserves. Marcus had told me he'd received maybe $3,000 and that he'd invested it in cryptocurrency that immediately crashed. I'd held him while he cried about disappointing my father, had reassured him that Dad would have understood, that trying and failing was honorable, that the gesture mattered more than the outcome. Every word of comfort I'd offered had been based on a lie. The bank records told the truth, $50,000 deposited into an account I didn't know existed. Within 48 hours, $15,000 had purchased an engagement ring, not for me, for Sienna. $20,000 became the down payment on a condo where he'd been living his double life for 9 months. $12,000 funded a 3-week vacation to Bali, the business trip he'd told me would establish connections for his consulting company. The remaining $3,000 went to furniture, clothes, and the kind of restaurants Marcus always claimed we couldn't afford when I suggested date nights. My father's last attempt to believe in Marcus's potential, his final gesture of generosity despite his reservations about our marriage, had been converted into seed money for the affair that would destroy us. Detective Hayes had slid the tissue box across his desk without comment. But the financial forensics revealed even more. For 18 months before the big thefts, Marcus had been systematically stealing smaller amounts. 200 here, 500 there, eventually working up to transfers of $2,000 and $3,000. The investigation traced it back to keylogger software he'd installed on our shared home computer, malware that recorded every password I typed, every security question I answered, every login credential I used. He'd studied me like a burglar studying a bank, documenting my patterns, waiting for the right moment to strike. Total theft before the joint account withdrawal: $23,000. Money I'd assumed went to normal expenses, bill payments, the cost of living. Money that actually funded hotel rooms, gifts for Sienna, and maintaining the fantasy life where he wasn't a failed entrepreneur living off his wife's salary but a successful man courting a woman who didn't know he was married. He's looking at 7 to 12 years if convicted on all counts, Detective Hayes had said, closing the folder. And Mrs. Blackwell, with the evidence we have. The federal database flags, the forged documents, the financial forensics, your testimony, conviction isn't a question. It's a certainty. The only question is whether he pleads out or forces a trial. Either way, he's going to prison. I'd asked when they'd arrest him. Detective Hayes had smiled, not a happy smile, but the satisfied smile of someone who'd planned something perfectly. His wedding is Saturday at 2 p.m., correct? Public venue, lots of witnesses, photographer capturing everything? I'd nodded, having seen every detail on Sienna's very public social media, where she'd posted about their perfect love story without realizing she was documenting evidence of bigamy. We'll be there, Detective Hayes had said. Because there's justice, and then there's poetic justice. And men like Marcus deserve the latter. He thought proposing to another woman with my father's money made him smart. He thought forging my signature made him free. He thought I'd never find out. Subscribe right now if you want to see how his wedding day became his arrest day, and why the money he celebrated stealing never actually existed. The final twist is something he'll spend years in prison thinking about. Now, sitting in that conference room while my colleagues whispered nervously, I thought about Saturday. About Marcus in whatever expensive tuxedo he'd purchased with money he didn't actually have, about Sienna in her $4,200 dress that I'd seen tagged in her Instagram posts, about guests gathering to celebrate a love story built on lies and felonies. About Detective Hayes and his team, waiting in the back with badges and handcuffs and federal warrants. About the exact moment when Marcus would realize that the house sale was void, the money was frozen, the new life was fiction, and the only thing real was the prison sentence. I didn't need to be there to witness it. I just needed to wait for my phone to ring with the confirmation that justice had arrived right on schedule, dressed in a tuxedo, thinking he'd won, walking straight into the consequences he'd spent 9 months earning. My boss was still staring at me with concern. "Evelyn, are you sure you're okay?" That laugh was concerning. I smiled, collected my papers, and stood. "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. I just remembered something important about federal trust law. Turns out, it's not boring paperwork after all. It's beautiful." Friday came and went. I didn't leave my house, the house Marcus thought he'd sold, the house that was still entirely, legally, federally mine. Saturday morning, I made coffee in the kitchen he'd abandoned, read the newspaper in the living room he thought belonged to someone else, and watered the garden he'd assumed he'd never see again. At 2 p.m., I was exactly where I belonged. At 2:47 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Detective Hayes, "It's done. In custody." You should have seen his face. I didn't need to. I could imagine it perfectly, and that was enough. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of perfect weather that makes you believe the universe has a sense of irony. 72 degrees, cloudless sky, gentle breeze, ideal conditions for a wedding, or in Marcus's case, ideal conditions for a very public arrest. I woke up in my bedroom, in my house, in the home that Marcus had celebrated selling 3 days earlier, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, actual peace. Not the numb resignation I'd been carrying while watching my marriage decompose, but genuine calm, the kind that comes from knowing that chaos is about to resolve itself without you having to lift a finger. I made French press coffee, the expensive beans Marcus always said we couldn't afford, the ones I'd been buying again since I knew our joint account withdrawal had been frozen by the bank's fraud department. I took my cup to the back patio and watched the morning light filter through the oak trees my father had loved, the ones he'd sat under during his last visit before the cancer took him, when he'd made me promise to protect myself legally because not everyone who says they love you actually does, sweetheart, and the law is the only thing that doesn't lie. He'd known. Maybe not specifically about Marcus's capacity for betrayal, but he'd known enough to build protections I hadn't understood I'd need. The trust wasn't just about the house. It was about him protecting me from beyond the grave, his final act of fatherhood encoded in federal law. If you haven't subscribed yet, you're about to miss the most satisfying wedding crash in history. And the final twist that proves Marcus didn't just fail, he failed so completely he destroyed himself for money that never existed. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens in the next 3 hours will restore your faith that justice actually works. While I sat in my garden sipping coffee, Marcus was presumably getting ready at the boutique hotel downtown, the Riverside Grand, a venue that cost $8,000 to book according to Sienna's detailed social media documentation of their dream day. I'd scrolled through her Instagram last night, not out of jealousy, but out of anthropological fascination with how someone could be so thoroughly deceived and so publicly enthusiastic about it. Every post was another piece of evidence. The dress-fitting photos, the cake-tasting videos, the rehearsal dinner stories, all of them tagging Marcus as her soulmate and the man who showed me what real love looks like. She had no idea she was marrying someone who was still legally married to me, who'd funded their entire relationship with stolen money, who'd proposed with a ring purchased using my dead father's final gift of faith. The comments on her posts were the typical wedding enthusiasm. Heart emojis, congratulations, you look so happy, affirmations from friends who were about to witness something very different than a happily ever after. I wondered if any of them would keep recording when Detective Hayes walked in, if the wedding photographer would capture the moment Marcus's face transformed from triumphant groom to federal defendant, if someone would post that footage online where it would live forever as a cautionary tale about hubris and fraud. By noon, I'd received a text from Detective Hayes, team in position. Ceremony starts at 2. We'll move during vows. Want you to know, his bail is set at $500,000. He won't make it. I'd texted back a simple thank you, though what I really wanted to say was more complicated. Thank you for believing me. Thank you for building a case so airtight that Marcus's overconfidence became evidence. Thank you for timing the arrest for maximum impact, not because I'm vindictive, but because men like Marcus only understand consequences when they're public and humiliating. Thank you for making sure my father's protections actually protected me. But thank you seemed sufficient. Detective Hayes understood. He'd mentioned during one of our meetings that his own sister had been financially abused by an ex-husband who'd emptied her accounts and fled to another state, and that case had gone cold because the thefts weren't quite large enough for federal attention. I couldn't help her, he'd said. But I can help you. And I can make damn sure Marcus becomes an example that maybe, just maybe, makes the next guy think twice. At 1 p.m., I turned on my phone's notifications and waited. Sienna's social media went active at 1:15, photos of her in the bridal suite, surrounded by bridesmaids, champagne glasses raised, captions about the happiest day of my life and marrying my best friend. The photographer she'd hired was documenting everything in real time, posting to the venue's Instagram story, groomsmen arriving, guests signing the book, flower arrangements being positioned. It was all so normal, so traditionally joyful, so completely unaware that 4 police officers and an assistant district attorney were already inside, dressed like regular guests, waiting. At 1:47, my lawyer Patricia Hoffman called. We'd been working together since the week after my father died. She'd been his colleague for 2 decades and had volunteered to handle my estate matters pro bono as a final gesture of respect for him. Evelyn, I wanted to update you before it happens. The criminal case is completely solid. Hayes sent me the warrant applications and they're flawless. But I also filed the emergency divorce petition this morning. By Monday, you'll have a temporary restraining order preventing Marcus from contesting any assets, and given that he'll be in custody, the divorce will be uncontested by default. You'll receive 100% of marital assets, the house remains in your trust untouched, and we're filing a civil judgment for the stolen funds plus damages. He's going to owe you approximately $230,000 when this is over. I'd asked the obvious question, can you collect from someone in prison? Patricia had laughed, not kindly. No. But the judgment follows him forever. Every paycheck he ever earns for the rest of his life gets garnished. He'll never own property, never have a bank account that isn't seized, never rebuild. It's a financial life sentence to match whatever prison term he serves. Your father would have appreciated the symmetry. She was right. My father had always believed that consequences should be proportional and permanent. If someone shows you who they are through their actions, he'd told me once, believe them, and make sure they can never do it to anyone else. At 2:03, Sienna posted a photo of the ceremony space, guests seated, aisle decorated with white roses, caption reading 5 minutes until I become Mrs. Marcus Hale. The comments were flooding in, more hearts, more congratulations, more people who had no idea they were about to witness a federal arrest instead of a wedding. I set my phone down and closed my eyes, imagining the scene I wouldn't witness but had played out 1,000 times in my head. Marcus at the altar in his tuxedo, probably rented because despite stealing $87,000 he'd already spent most of it and didn't actually have access to the rest. Sienna walking down the aisle in her expensive dress, paid for with credit cards Marcus had maxed out thinking he had hundreds of thousands in backup funds. The officiant beginning the ceremony, asking if anyone objected to this union. And what a moment that would have been if I'd actually attended, though Detective Hayes had specifically requested I stay away to avoid any suggestion that I'd orchestrated this as personal revenge rather than letting the legal system function independently. The vow starting, Marcus saying I do to a woman he'd lied to as thoroughly as he'd lied to me, Sienna saying I do to a man whose entire existence was fiction. And then, just as the officiant began to pronounce them married, the doors opening. Subscribe right now if you believe justice should be public, because what happened next at 2:14 p.m. is exactly why you never, ever underestimate federal law, or the wife you betrayed. Only subscribers get the full story, and trust me, you don't want to miss how completely this unraveled. My phone buzzed at 2:14. Detective Hayes, target acquired. In custody. Multiple charges filed. Assistant DA reading him his rights in front of approximately 60 witnesses. Subject's fiancé is hysterical. Photographer got everything. You were right, he never saw it coming. I responded, thank you. What did he say? The reply came 2 minutes later, first words out of his mouth, but I sold the house. The money's mine. She can't do this. We informed him the house was never his to sell, the sale was void from day one, he's been under federal investigation for 3 weeks, and every transaction was monitored and documented. He asked for a lawyer. We said he'd need one. His fiancée asked if he was still married. We confirmed he was. She removed her ring and threw it at him. Best wedding I've ever attended. I sat with that image for a long moment. Marcus, handcuffed in his tuxedo, surrounded by guests who'd come to celebrate love and were instead watching a perp walk. Sienna, realizing in real time that everything he'd told her was a lie, the divorce that never happened, the house that was never his, the money that didn't exist, the business success that was pure fiction. The photographer capturing it all, images that would probably end up as evidence in the trial. The venue staff trying to figure out what to do with a wedding reception for a wedding that had just been interrupted by a federal arrest. The cake, the catered meal, the DJ, all prepared for a celebration that had transformed into a crime scene. But Detective Hayes's message hadn't included the detail I was waiting for, so I texted back, what about the money? His response took 5 minutes, and when it came, I laughed out loud in my empty garden, the same genuine laugh that had concerned my colleagues 3 days earlier. That's the best part. We just informed him. He went pale. Started hyperventilating. Had to sit down. One of the groomsmen asked what was wrong, and Marcus said, "The money." "I don't have any of the money." "Want me to explain it to him again just to watch his face?" "Because I absolutely will." I told him that wouldn't be necessary, though I appreciated the offer. The explanation had already been delivered, and Marcus was already processing the final, devastating twist that elevated his failure from mere catastrophe to almost Shakespearean tragedy. The $87,000 he'd withdrawn from our joint accounts, the money he'd celebrated stealing, the funds he'd spent the last 3 weeks mentally allocating to his new life with Sienna, had never actually been in his possession. The dual authorization security feature I'd set up on our accounts years ago, the one that required bank verification for any withdrawal over $50,000, had triggered an automatic fraud alert the moment Marcus overrode it. The money had been transferred to a suspended holding account pending investigation. Frozen. Inaccessible. Marcus had spent 3 weeks thinking he had $87,000 available, building budgets around it, making promises to Sienna based on it, charging purchases to credit cards he planned to pay off with it. He'd racked up $43,000 in new debt, furniture for the condo, wedding expenses, a pre-wedding trip to wine country, the security deposit on a luxury car lease he'd planned to surprise Sienna with after the honeymoon. All of it purchased with money he thought he had but had never actually possessed. And the house sale proceeds, the $650,000 Marcus had triumphantly announced on Tuesday's phone call, had suffered the same fate. The moment Marcus's real estate attorney submitted the closing documents to escrow, the federal trust database flagged the transaction as fraudulent. The money had been frozen in an escrow account pending verification from the Office of Trust Management, verification that would never come because the sale was illegal from inception. Marcus had never touched a single dollar of that $650,000. He'd just committed multiple felonies attempting to steal it, destroyed his freedom pursuing it, and built an entire fantasy future on money that existed only in his imagination. Total amount Marcus successfully stole after 9 months of planning, 18 months of systematic theft, and countless hours of building his escape, $0.00. Total amount Marcus now owed in legal judgments, stolen funds, damages, and restitution, approximately $230,000. Total debt Marcus had accumulated celebrating money he never had. $43,000 in credit cards, plus $8,000 for the wedding venue, plus whatever he'd promised Sienna about their future. Total prison time Marcus faced if convicted on all federal charges, 7 to 12 years. The mathematics of his failure were almost poetic. If you're watching this and thinking karma isn't real, let me tell you, sometimes karma comes with handcuffs and federal charges. Subscribe before you miss stories like this, because the universe delivers justice in the most unexpected ways, and you don't want to miss a single moment. Hit subscribe now. Monday morning, I returned to work like nothing had happened, because for me, nothing really had. My house was still mine, my accounts were being restored by the bank's fraud department, my life was fundamentally unchanged except for the absence of a man who'd been emotionally absent for years anyway. My colleagues asked carefully if I was okay, having heard through office gossip that something had happened over the weekend, though details were scarce. I told them I was fine, that some personal matters had resolved themselves, that I appreciated their concern. What I didn't tell them was that Marcus was in county jail on $500,000 bail he couldn't make, that Sienna had posted a long, rambling Instagram story about betrayal and deception before deleting her entire account, that the wedding photographer had contacted Detective Hayes offering to provide all footage as evidence in exchange for a statement that she'd been an unwitting witness rather than a participant. What I didn't mention was that Patricia had already received Marcus's public defender's request for a meeting to discuss possible plea arrangements, or that the assistant district attorney had told her they weren't interested in plea deals because we want this case to go to trial as a deterrent to other people who think spousal fraud is a victimless crime. I didn't tell them that Detective Hayes had sent me the police report, which included Marcus's statement from the jail intake. I don't understand how this happened. I planned everything perfectly. The house was supposed to be sold. The money was supposed to be mine. She was supposed to be gone. How did she know? How did she do this? According to the report, Detective Hayes had responded, she didn't do anything. You did. You forged documents on a federally protected property. You stole from monitored accounts. You committed fraud that automatically reported itself to law enforcement. She just let you. And the law did the rest. That statement, she just let you, felt like the truest summary of the entire situation. I hadn't orchestrated Marcus's downfall. I'd simply allowed him to execute it himself, provided him with enough rope and enough arrogance and enough unmonitored time to weave that rope into a noose, tie it carefully around his own neck, and step confidently off the platform thinking he was stepping into freedom. The law had been the trap, not me. The federal trust, the fraud alerts, the automatic reporting systems, the database flags, all of it had been waiting like a spider web, invisible until the moment of contact, and then inescapable. My father had built that web 3 years ago, and Marcus had walked into it thinking it was boring paperwork, legal nonsense, nothing that mattered in the real world where clever men could outsmart systems if they were just bold enough. Tuesday afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor at my office. Detective Hayes, out of uniform, looking somehow younger without the badge and official bearing. Mrs. Blackwell, I wanted to update you personally. Marcus's public defender convinced him to take a plea deal after all. Turns out spending 4 days in county jail was educational. He's pleading guilty to 3 felony counts, identity theft, fraud in a real estate transaction, and wire fraud. Prosecution agreed to drop the remaining charges. Sentencing is scheduled for next month, but the range is 5 to 8 years with possibility of parole after 3. He'll also be required to pay full restitution, though as your attorney probably mentioned, collection will be difficult. I asked if he seemed remorseful. Detective Hayes considered this carefully. He seems sorry he got caught. He seems shocked that the consequences are real. But remorseful for what he did to you? For stealing your father's gift? For the betrayal? No. He mostly seems angry that you trapped him, his word. He genuinely believes you orchestrated this somehow, that you knew all along and set him up. His public defender tried to explain that federal trust law isn't a conspiracy, it's just law, but Marcus can't seem to accept that he simply didn't understand what he was dealing with. It's easier for him to believe you're a mastermind than to accept he's just a fool. That seemed about right. Marcus had always preferred comforting lies to uncomfortable truths. As Detective Hayes stood to leave, he paused at my office door. Your father was a good man. I appeared before him twice in my early career, testifying in financial fraud cases. He was thorough, fair, and he genuinely seemed to hurt for the victims. I think he'd be proud of how this turned out. Not happy that it was necessary, but proud that his protections worked exactly as he designed them. After he left, I sat at my desk thinking about my father, about the trust documents I'd signed 3 years ago without fully understanding their significance, about all the small ways he'd tried to protect me even when I didn't think I needed protection. The trust hadn't just been about the house. It had been about teaching me that some things are worth protecting legally because not everyone who says they love you actually does. It had been about showing me that the law, properly understood and properly applied, is more powerful than manipulation or charm or confident lies. It had been about ensuring that if someone ever tried to take what was mine, the system itself would defend me, no dramatic confrontation required, no he said she said arguments, just automatic consequences triggered by automatic systems, justice delivered by mathematics and databases and federal registries that don't care about charm or excuses. My father had given me a gift more valuable than the house. He'd given me a framework that made betrayal expensive and consequences inevitable. Before this ends, ask yourself, are you legally protected from the people you trust most? Subscribe and comment below with your answer. because the scariest thing about this story isn't that Marcus tried to steal everything, it's that he almost succeeded because I didn't know what protections I had. Don't be unprepared. Subscribe now so you never miss stories that might just save your assets, your sanity, or your life. That Friday, exactly 1 week after Marcus had told me to be out of his house, I had friends over for dinner. People I'd been too embarrassed to socialize with while my marriage was dying, colleagues I'd kept at professional distance because I didn't want to answer questions about why Marcus never attended company events anymore. We ate on the back patio under the oak trees, drank wine that actually cost what the bottle claimed, and I told them the whole story from beginning to end. They listened with the kind of rapt attention usually reserved for true crime podcasts, gasping at the appropriate moments, cheering when I described the wedding arrest, sitting in stunned silence when I explained that Marcus never actually got any of the money he'd stolen. So he destroyed his entire life, one friend summarized, for money that was never actually in his possession, using a plan that automatically reported him to police, betraying a wife whose house he couldn't legally sell because of protections he never bothered to understand? I nodded. That's exactly right. Another friend raised her glass, to your father. To federal trust law. And to Marcus, who gave us all a perfect example of what happens when arrogance meets consequences. We drank to that. Later, alone in my living room, the living room Marcus had thought belonged to someone else, in the house he'd celebrated selling, surrounded by the life he'd assumed he was escaping, I thought about justice and revenge and the difference between them. I hadn't plotted Marcus's downfall. I hadn't schemed or manipulated or set traps. I'd simply existed within legal protections I'd barely understood until I needed them, and I'd allowed Marcus to collide with systems designed specifically to stop people like him. The revenge, if you could call it that, wasn't mine. It belonged to federal databases and fraud alerts and automatic reporting systems and laws written by people who understood that trust must be protected by more than just faith. It belonged to my father, who'd seen enough betrayal in his courtroom to know that love alone doesn't protect anyone, but properly structured legal frameworks can. It belonged to Detective Hayes and prosecutors who treated financial abuse as the serious crime it actually is. My only contribution had been patience, the willingness to wait, to document, to let Marcus think he'd won long enough to ensure he'd lose everything. Some people call that revenge. I call it just letting someone finish what they started. Marcus had built his own prison, brick by brick, lie by lie, theft by theft. He'd just been too arrogant to notice he was building walls around himself instead of bridges to freedom. And now he'd spend the next 5 to 8 years sitting in an actual prison, thinking about the house he never sold, the money he never stole, the wife who never fought back because she never had to, and the federal trust law he'd dismissed as boring paperwork. I hoped those years gave him time to learn the difference between being clever and being smart, between competence and competence, between what you think you know and what you should have learned. But mostly, I just hoped he stayed gone. I had a house to live in, a life to rebuild, and a father's memory to honor by never again trusting anyone enough to ignore the protections he'd built. Some lessons cost everything to learn. Marcus was learning his. I'd already learned mine.